Afternoon and welcome everyone to our 5th Sexual Violence Task Force Roundtable of 2020. I want to explain that my Vice Chair, Jackie Spear, who is usually with us, cannot be with us today, but for a good reason. She is the chair of an oversight Armed Services Committee hearing on the sexual assaults happening at Fort Hood, and we want to wish her well. Jackie has been a very capable co-chair working on these issues for years, and I'm happy to have her in that role. We are hoping to be joined by Representative David Joyce and Representative John Katko, who are my Republican co-chairs. This has been a tough year for everyone, and I want to begin by extending my thanks to all of the advocates and allies who are listening today for your work supporting survivors and adapting to the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to thank my co-chairs, Jackie Spear, Dave Joyce, and John Katko, and I'm grateful to all of you for being with us and for your partnership this year. This summer, we held a roundtable to dive into racial disparities in access to care and support that survivors need. It's clear that the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating this disparity and leaving survivors of color more vulnerable than ever. And let me give you a few stats that are very troubling. Over 18% of all African-American women report being abused in their lifetime. And this doesn't even account for the vast majority of those who do not come forward at all. For every 15 African-American women who experience rape, only one will report what happened. In working toward this task force mission to eradicate sexual violence, we need to address the additional barriers facing survivors of color. And that means making sure that federal resources through the Violence Against Women Act, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and other funding streams are fairly distributed. It means ensuring that survivors of human trafficking are helped, not punished, and recognizing that unaddressed trauma, especially in children, can directly contribute to behavior that results in run-ins with the criminal justice system. The organization Rights for Girls has identified this as the quote-unquote abuse to prison pipeline. And I've seen the effects of this myself when visiting our women's prison in my home state of New Hampshire. Last winter, I was up at the women's prison just before COVID started, and I was stunned to learn from our warden that 100% of the women in our women's prison are survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, or abuse and neglect in their childhood. 100%. As Congress will continue to tackle issues surrounding police reform, it's imperative that we recognize that sexual violence will persist where survivors don't feel safe reaching out to law enforcement, or where they do reach out but are dismissed or ignored. There's so much to understand about these challenges and how Congress can be helpful. We continue to build on this discussion today, and we're very grateful to have 3 extraordinary survivors and advocates joining us today. Lavinia Masters' rape kit sat untested for over 2 decades. This outrage inspired action, and she has become a tremendous advocate for addressing rape kit backlogs across this country. The Lavinia Masters Act became law in Texas last year, and it's a comprehensive legislation for tracking rape kits, clearing the backlog, and extending the statute of limitations for prosecuting these crimes. Lavinia, thank you for being with us. Gail Gardner survived sexual abuse as a child and survived being assaulted by a home intruder as an adult. She's made it her mission to educate the public on the warning signs of child sexual abuse and has worked with Congress on initiatives strengthening the Violence Against Women Act. Through her work in pastoral counseling, she's helped countless survivors heal from their trauma. Thank you, Gail, for being with us today. Melanie Thompson is a speaker, activist, and leader in the global fight to end sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Trafficked in New York at age 12, arrested for prostitution a few years later, and then placed in the foster care system, she became an activist at age 14. She has testified before numerous legislatures about the need to pass strong anti-trafficking laws and ending the arrests of those who are sex trafficked. It's an honor to have each of you join us today, and we look forward to hearing from you and talking about our work, the work that we will be doing together. So at this time, let's see, do we have, I think we'll just dive in though. If we don't have Representative Joyce and Katko, we'll let them just go ahead and join us when they arrive. But for now, let's dive in. Lavinia, if you are ready to go first, we'll take your comments, and then we'll go to Gail, and then we'll go to Melanie, and then we'll open it up to my colleagues for their comments.
Thank you so much, Representative Kuster. My screen here.
You're good. We hear you.
Okay. Chairwoman Kuster, honorable co-chairs, Congressman Spear, Joyce, Keiko, and Mervyn and Bacon that joined us. Thank you for inviting me to participate today and highlight important issues impacting survivors of sexual violence with a focus on victims of color. My name, as she stated, is Lavinia Masters, and I am the founder and executive director of Hope Saves Ministry. It's an organization that uses innovative and creative ways to purposely empower and sexual assault survivors to find their voices and speak, while powerfully partnering with legislators and other entities that carry out the promises to secure justice and safety for all survivors of sexual violence. I also have the bittersweet honor of being a victim of childhood sexual abuse and a heinous and violent rape at the age of 13 years old. I say bittersweet because the effects of sexual violence can leave you tormented and bitter, but when you overcome and find the purpose in your pain, such as myself, it can make your days seem sweeter as you progress as a thriving survivor. Honorable chairpersons, with me finding my purpose within my pain, it has led and allowed me to do bigger and greater things to not only empower me, but to empower other survivors of sexual assault. You see, the barbaric rape that I suffered at the age of 13 was just the first victimization that I endured that night. Later, I learned 21 years later, as Representative Kuster spoke earlier about, I suffered a second victimization, and that was finding out that my kit sat on the shelf for over 21 years, having me to miss my turn at justice because I missed 2 statute of limitations after that. And so this purpose-filled journey led me to vow that no other girl, I'm sorry, my little fingers just got excited. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I've lost 2 statute of limitations. So this purpose-filled journey led me to vow that no other girl would suffer at the hands of a rapist and not have justice, answers, the opportunity for healing, and to be empowered. Not another one, but especially my little Black girls. So here I am, a sister warrior, still on this battlefield. One of my greatest badges of honor is, like she said, House Bill 8, the Lavinia Masters Act, an act they passed in the state of Texas to end the rape kit backlog. And yes, you heard it correctly. I am the namesake for this law. I serve the state of Texas Governor's Sexual Assault Task Force, State Representative Victoria Niave Special Task Force for Sexual Violence, and the TASA's first ever Survivor Advisory Board. I mention all of this not to boost myself or my ego, but to encourage other victims and survivors of sexual violence that may be watching or listening, with hopes they will grasp that their testimony before them today in Congress is not just a testimony, but it's for them to find the purpose beyond their traumatic pain, and they can make the impact in lives of those who desire to remove from their own dark brokenness. I share because my boys and my girls to know you as a victim matter, that you have a powerful voice and need to be heard. So refuse to accept what society has fed us for far too long, and that we are to blame for the terrible things that happen to us, especially my little Black girls. Speaking of Black girls and sexual violence, if you give me another minute, I want to share a brief history and some reasons why many victims of color see the injustices served to Black victims of sexual violence are discriminatory and systematically traumatic. Yet I pray that starting today, collectively, we can begin to heal and bridge those gaps while eradicating these behaviors altogether. Their names are Carol Spinks, 13 years old, Darlena Johnson, 16 years old, Brenda Faye Crockett, 10 years old, Nino Miosha Yates, 12 years old, Brenda Woodard, 18 years old, and finally Diane Williams, 17 years old. They were all brutally raped and murdered from April 25th, 1971 to September the 5th, 1972. And all of their bodies were dumped alongside or in the vicinity of I-295 in DC. Their cases went cold and remain unsolved as of today because the evidence that was collected, and I quote, that law enforcement did such a poor job preserving it that nothing could be done with it. Even when DNA analysis came around in 1990, to add insult to injury, as of 2018, no one even knows where this evidence is. And although these tragedies are gut-wrenching for us, gut-wrenching, come on computer, I'm sorry, love technology, are gut-wrenching for us within themselves, part of the that disturbed me and still disturbs me is that today, at this very moment, all these girls, all these future queens, all these future women of greatness were Black girls whose lives were stripped from them at such young ages, and Black girls whose history is still stripped from them because it appears that our America, our justice system, our law enforcement that people of color helped shape and form did and still does not see the value in their precious lives. So they all lie in shallow, unknown graves, gone too soon, and some seem to me forgotten forever. This is what I saw in those unsolved murders of those 6 Black girls. The lack of concern and dismissal of prioritization because possibly even maybe the color of their skin. This is what I see when I read the history of Black women then and now when it comes to sexual violence in my country. This is the interpretation that law enforcement and the justice system inadvertently gives out when you fail to prioritize Black girls, rape kits in a timely fashion, when you fail to prioritize safety measures, sexual assault awareness, education, and other healing resources in our rural and impoverished neighborhoods. Our system is guilty of discriminatory behaviors when you imply that all Black girls are supposed to be raped because of their attitudes and cultural backgrounds. Therefore, you are slow to impose swift justice while focusing or destroying our credibility. It is guilty of discriminatory behavior when funding is not available to create more trauma-based hospitals and crisis centers in predominantly Black communities. This discriminatory behavior is destroying our little Black girls, even though they have the desire to be free from sexual violence. Our system fails to bring mandated trauma-informed training and education to peace officers and first responders on how to address, console, and secure the safety of a victim of sexual violence, mental, physical, emotional, and overall well-being after assault. Your honorable chairs, intimidation has no place when dealing with a rape victim. Victim blaming has no place when dealing with a rape victim. Destroying or not collecting evidence has no place when dealing with a rape victim. Minimizing the assault and condescending or sarcastic remarks to the survivor has no place when dealing with a rape victim. Making your own presumptions on how or why the rape occurred has no place when dealing with a rape victim. And finally, but most importantly, none of these behaviors are appropriate when they appear to be more heavily proposed upon Black rape victims. These are the saying of history. They say that history repeats itself, but I know and now confident with the support of our elected leaders that beginning today that we can change and rewrite our history for the greater good. You see that after learning the history of the 6 Black girls that were killed in DC back in the 70s, I saw how easy it was to forget so many other Black girls, from Reese Taylor, Maya Angelou, then poor Aliana DeFries. And that is just one name among thousands of Black girls that you can't even Google because it appears that a Black victim's rape is not even newsworthy. I am determined to help rewrite history today because what I also learned that history repeated itself in my case, as it forgot about me on the shelf for all those years. It failed to provide me with proper resources and counseling. It failed to bring any perpetrator to justice and caused me to miss 2 statute of limitations. It failed to bring education awareness to my impoverished schools and communities so I could have learned and trained and be trained about sexual trauma. My system failed me, this little Black girl that had big dreams and aspirations. So here I am today, I'm still standing and I'm still rewriting her story. And the story started out, little Black girl raped in the West Dallas projects on the night of July 31st, 1985 by an unknown assailant. Evidence collected, she couldn't identify perp in books the next day, case suspended the day after. To my story now, Lavinia Masters, once a rape victim at 13 years old, identified perp with DNA evidence over 21 years later, fought to get backlog cleared, statute of limitations changed, a better system implemented that led it to the law, and the first to be named after a surviving Black victim, I may add, being implemented in Texas as her namesake, the Lavinia Masters Act. And as she continues to be a voice for victims in Texas, she comes up with creative ideas to reform sexual violence. She also requested a call to action before Congress and our elected officials to reform how rape victims are handled after an assault by destroying any discriminatory behaviors or practices against them, and to take special care with our little Black girls, because we too want to have our names a part of this bittersweet, non-biased history. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, that was incredible. And here you are in front of Congress telling your story. That's really incredible.
Thank you.
And I love that line about empowering through your trauma. And
Yes.
I'm also a survivor, and I think it's really an important message, is that
Yes.
the advocacy is part of the healing. And I think
Yes, it is.
you've done an amazing job. I really
you so
appreciate
much,
you sharing that story.
Thank you.
Now we do have my co-chair, Representative Dave Joyce, I guess had some computer problems. Dave, do you want to make any just short comments at the top? Or if not, we'll keep going. You're going to have to unmute. There we go.
I have a new computer that has no camera and no mic. So
Oh.
I was listening, and then I couldn't believe, I couldn't.
I hate to say that. I hope it's not a metaphor for Congress, but anyway, a computer with no camera and no mic. Just know we're here working together in a bipartisan way.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate all of you being here, and I continue to look forward to this testimony and how we can work together to try to fix some of these problems that we've had. Thank you for your testimony, Lavinia.
And Dave, I mentioned that Jackie Spear can't be with us because they're having an oversight hearing about the situation with sexual assault at Fort Hood over at Armed Services. So I'm glad she's on top of that. And I think Mr. Katko will come. You know, Representative Bacon, Representative Robin Kelly, and then please meet our Representative-elect Frank Mervan, who's taking Mr. Lipinski's seat. Sorry, I should know my own. Okay, with that, let me introduce Gail Gardner. And Gail, thank you for being with us. And if you just want to unmute, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman Kuster and honorable co-chairs, Congresswoman Spear in her absence, Congressman Joyce and Congressman Keiko. Thank you for inviting me to participate today to highlight the police bias that impacts survivors of sexual violence, especially with women of color. My name is Gail Gardner, and I'm a pastoral counselor, advocate, author, and survivor of sexual violence. On the surface, you might look at me and see a successful retired educator, someone who has risen to help others. But my journey started like too many young women in poor Black communities. I had the deck stacked against me. I grew up in the city projects in New York. Like too many other girls of color, I was sexually abused by a family member starting at the age of 5. Coping with the effects of the abuse drove me to drugs and alcohol, and eventually dropping out of school. But as a single parent, I went to college, and although it took me 20 years, I earned my degree and became an award-winning educator. Tragically, while my career was taking off, my home was broken into, and I became the victim of a man police now refer to as the Malibu rapist. I did what I was told. I called the police and was taken to the hospital to get a sexual forensic exam known as a rape kit. It was archaic. I was an African-American woman who had been raped, which was not taken seriously at the time by law enforcement. I was taken to a bare hospital room that only had a tray of metal instruments in it. All of my clothes were taken away, and I was only given a sheet to wear. It was freezing cold. They left me in there by myself for so long, just waiting. It was horrible. When the nurse finally came in, she started the exam without saying a word to me. The detective was even worse. Even though she was a woman, she and her partners openly mocked and made faces while I told my story. The experience was awful. It was like being raped all over again. After all that, my rape kit was not tested. It was put on a shelf where it sat, and my case was moved to the cold case file. At 73, I'm using my voice and my history as a survivor of sexual violence to make a difference. You see, my story is not yet over. While working on my memoir, I went to the police department to get the records of my rape and saw that my case from 31 years ago was still open. After all this time, because of one-time law in Florida, they had finally tested my rape kit. In October, I was informed that I was one of many victims of a serial rapist. I cannot help but think what would have been different if I had been a white woman from a wealthy neighborhood. How many women suffered because we were not important enough in the eyes of law enforcement? We need to do more. I have done a lot to try to make a difference and help survivors, but I'm just one person. Today, I'm asking you to act and to use the power to have to make a substantial difference. As of this time, I am working with a group, an organization that is taking petitions right now in order to pass Gale's Law, and where we can finally put an end to the backlog of rape kits in the state of Florida. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. And one of the issues that our task force has tackled is the issue of rape kits. There's an actress you may know named Mariska Hargitay, who came in and testified. She was so powerful.
Yes.
And she was talking about, there were a couple of cities out in the Midwest where they had this type of process where I think one day it might have been Cleveland or Detroit. In any event, they had tested like 10,000 rape kits that had been sitting on a shelf, and they found like 800 serial rapists. The people who were in those rape kits were raping over and over. They're predator serial rapists. And I think part of the thing that we learned from that is that the law enforcement had the position that if you knew who the perpetrator is, you didn't need the rape kit. But the truth of the matter is, the point of the rape kit is that then you can see these patterns and prosecute. And not, it wasn't just for identifying the perpetrator, is my point. It was that the same perpetrators were going over and over. So I think Melanie, I'm sorry, Melanie, you came back briefly. If you want to come on now, we'd love to hear from Melanie Thompson. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Gail, Livonia, you guys are amazing. It's like an honor to follow the both of you. So really all I'm here to do, I'm going to share a little bit about my background, how I got into this work, and then I'm going to focus on two main points that are driving forces for me here in New York State that I think would still be beneficial if you guys would all jump on that and learn a little bit about how you can impact your communities with that. So again, my name is Melanie Thompson. I was sex trafficked here in New York State when I was 12 years old. I was kidnapped and put into an abandoned house, locked in a closet from the outside, and have remained in prostitution on and off for many years thereafter. At the age of 14, I was arrested on a PIMS warrant charge, and I was put into the foster care system, where I bounced around from multiple facilities, mental hospitals, multiple foster care homes, and then eventually transitioned out into my own, I would say like college living, but I went on my own independently at some point. So I'm bringing to you a vast perspective when it comes to the issue of human trafficking, but also sexual violence in its entirety. So one of the things I want to focus on, and it may be a little bit different than some of the things you've heard so far, is the notion and the term of sex work. So sex work, if you haven't already heard about it, is a term that is becoming more and more on the rise, slightly popular, and it is used to describe somebody that engages in prostitution or sexual acts in exchange for something. One of the biggest pushes that I have here in New York State is to eradicate the term sex work, as it is a term that was used to sanitize the inherent harms of prostitution. And contrary to what many people believe, I like to say sex work is neither. Sex is not work and work is not sex. That being said, the issue is that a lot of people view prostitution and trafficking as individual choices and not as systems. So I think that we need to share and change our perspective on how we view the system of prostitution. And it goes like this, in my brain, it makes the most sense. If you view prostitution as an oppressive system that thrives on other oppressive systems, that being racism, patriarchy, misogyny, capitalism, if you view the system of prostitution in that regard and see that it does not put the individual who's being exploited at the center of its development, then you could recognize how prostitution can never be something that we should fully decriminalize or legalize, at least here in the US. A lot of people have a misconception about brothels, about places in Nevada, strip clubs, and a lot of people, and forgive me if I'm jumping because it's so much that I want to get into a couple of minutes, but at least here in New York, a lot of people love to say to me, what about people who strip, or what about people who weren't kidnapped, or what about people who don't have pimps or exploiters, right? And sex work was this term that was used to try to describe those individuals, people who did not fit into the stereotype of what human trafficking looks like. What we hear when you hear human trafficking, you hear people or some people automatically think of movies like Taken, where you're kidnapped and smuggled across country borders, or you have these stock photos that show girls that are chained to basements or chained to radiators and things of that nature. And those things do happen. I personally serve as somebody and living proof, and I put a face to a story that differs from that. So I was a regular girl going to school when I was in middle school. I hung out with my friends at a movie theater, and I was taken after the movie theater and put into what would or could be considered a brothel or a trap house where I'm from. But it looks different than what we see in the movie. So one of the things that I want to emphasize when it comes to this notion of sex work and this idea is how it relates to policy. Here in New York, there's a huge, huge push for full decriminalization of prostitution. What that will entail, if that becomes law, is we will see an increase and an influx in human trafficking. Why? Because if you make prostitution fully decriminalized, in turn, a lot of people like to point out this difference, like saying, we're not talking about legalizing it, we're talking about decriminalizing it. In actuality, the consequences for those who perpetrate it are the same. There will be no consequences. So under full legalization, sex buyers, pimps, they get away with whatever they do. Under full decriminalization, they still get no jail time. They still get away with whatever they do. And a lot of people don't like to point out that difference. So I think it's super imperative to recognize that if we do implement full decriminalization of prostitution, of human trafficking, however it's defined in your state, what we will see is that now in your state, wherever it's decriminalized, it will become a sex tourism destination. And because you don't have enough constituents to fulfill that demand, you need to transport the supply. So you take more people from other states to fulfill the demand in your state, because of course, in all 50 states, prostitution is currently illegal with the exception of a few counties in Nevada. So with that being said, if you don't want to see an influx in trafficking, you need to not decriminalize or legalize prostitution in your state. And the last thing that I wanted to point out, or maybe one of the last things, the equality model is a policy that I'm currently very much in favor for, and do a lot of advocacy work around here in New York State, but it is implemented in other places. You may have heard of, if you know anything about this topic, you may have heard it known as the Nordic model or the abolitionist model or partial decriminalization. There's many different names for it. But essentially it's a potential law. We have a bill drafted and we're trying to get that implemented here, where it's an alternative to both full legalization and full decriminalization. And what that does is decriminalize the person who's being exploited in the sex trade, but also at the same time keeps the penalties for those who perpetrate it. So sex buyers would not be decriminalized, pimps would not be decriminalized. And to me, it's the only one that makes sense. But for many people, there's this huge debate on sex work because of the idea of agency and autonomy and this false notion of empowerment. What I want to point out is that overwhelmingly and disproportionately, 95+% of Black and brown individuals are those who are targeted by the sex trade. We are the ones that fall victim to the most sexual violence. We are the ones, especially if you're living marginalized like I was, growing up in a poor home, growing up in a DV home, being in foster care, identifying on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, having any type of sexual violence history in your lifetime, being addicted to drugs or have issues with substance use, etc. All of these things are precursors and pre-existing conditions for us that make us more susceptible to being trafficked, more susceptible to being raped, and absolutely more susceptible to engaging in prostitution. And with that in mind, I love to say that we make laws, and I mean, I'm not a person that makes laws. I just advocate for them, right? But I love to say that we don't make laws for the minority. We make laws for the majority. And it's really interesting to me, at least here in my state, to see how there's such a huge debate when it comes to any laws or policies related to any type of sexual violence or gender-based violence. But when it comes to things like traffic tickets or drugs or anything like that, everybody can come to one huge consensus on what's wrong and what's right. But when it comes down to the exploitation of somebody's body, when it comes down to somebody violating or gaining for themselves sexual access to somebody's body without their permission, when it comes to rape kits, when it comes to testing, now all of a sudden there needs to be all of these huge discussions. The reality is, people that look like me and darker, people who have suffered like me, people who have these pre-existing conditions, we are already at a disadvantage in society. Let's just put it out there. But in addition to that, our disadvantages in society are what make us even more prone to these injustices. And, I know that we can't change the world in a day, and I know that individually we may not be able to make certain changes. However, I do think that there is a lot that you can do from your positions, and with the authority and the power and the resources that you have, it needs to be reallocated back into our communities. We need to focus on this population of individuals. Women, girls are inferior, LGBTQ. There's so many different categories of people that need help. But when it comes to the issue of sexual violence and gender-based violence and human trafficking and prostitution, there are so many of us that are overwhelmingly Black and brown, with a disproportionate over 85% of sex buyers being middle-aged white men with discretionary income. I think that once we address the realities of the racism systemically, then we can address how and why so many of people that look like me are being exploited, and how so many of us end up being raped, and how our rape kits are the ones that sit on the shelves for all these years. Livonia. So I just think that we need to focus on that, and we need to just have more discussions, even in your offices and your districts, about, even on a smaller scale, the communities that you have, the constituents that you have that make up this representative number when it comes to sexual violence and gender-based violence. So I just want to throw that out there. And I apologize if that was all over the place, but I do hope that, my message was conveyed, at least in the slightest way. So thank you guys for having me once again.
You did awesome, Melanie. You did awesome. I'm proud of you. You're a great advocate. What an extraordinary story. The courage and just the strength that you have, and your positive spirit after all of that is really coming through. So thank you for being with us. With that, Dave Joyce, do we still have you? I think maybe not. Robin Kelly, would you like to, and Dave is having some computer issues, so when he comes back, but I'm going to turn the floor over to my friend Robin Kelly. Thank you, Robin, for being with us, and she's a great ally in this work. So,
really, I just feel like saying, whew,
I know.
listening to everyone. I am the co-chair in the caucus on Black women and girls, so I am glad to meet each and every one of you, and I will probably be back in contact with you, because we do all kind of things all across the country, well, at least pre-COVID. But in my area in Chicago, I actually did a sex trafficking seminar, and I didn't realize, and I don't know, Rep. Bacon, if you realize that the I-57 corridor is so bad, and they actually have, that's the more rural part of my district, and they have a sex trafficking or task force. All the police from Bradley and different places like that. I was just really, really surprised. Do you feel, I know we talk about like the victims don't speak up enough, and when you're so young, do you feel that it's people that people know mostly, or not necessarily, just random? What do you think it is, first of all, as far as that issue?
And you're talking about
As far as
sexual assault in the first
yeah.
instance against
Like,
children
is
or
that
against
why,
anybody?
it might be scary to speak up because it's someone, it could be a family friend, could be a relative, or, is that, part of the issue also? And then and do you think like police training or social work training or whatever training has gotten any better?
Can I speak to that?
Sure, yeah.
Those are two questions.
Because you hit on something that is really important to me, and that is trauma training, and of course, Victims Against Violence Against Women's Act that has been laying in dust. The House passed it, the Senate has not, and now I can see hopefully our president-elect will go back into what he put together years ago, where we get to see, because we have a new generation of people who are now in law enforcement and in our court systems. And it's just more racism now is no more hidden thing. It's out in front for everyone. And I believe that that training that goes with how to handle a situation. I had will be different. I had a woman who was a detective, as I said, who was serving as a victim's advocate. There was no agency back then for providers. And she needed to be trained, but we didn't have that training back then. So I think this is a good time that people are trained and know how to work with people of color, as well as anyone who's had a trauma, happen to them, like sexual violence or childhood sexual assault, adult abuse. It's a matter of being able to know what to say and what not to say. And at the age that we're looking at a younger generation of victims and a younger generation of law enforcement. So it's needed. Thank you.
Yeah, Melanie or Lavinia, do you want to join in on that one?
Well, I would like to say, like Ms. Gill said, Representative Kelly, that training, I feel it should be mandated, and it should be more of an organized, trauma-informed training across the board of how to handle victims of sexual assault, especially African-American women. Being a survivor myself of a violent childhood sexual abuse and a violent rape, I can remember my emotions were all over the place, and it seemed like I was erratic and everything else because, I'm a virgin child. I don't know what happened. I don't know this person that came in my house, but I have police officers standing there saying, are you sure it's not your boyfriend? Are you sure you didn't let him in the window? And are you sure you're not having sex and you don't want your mama to find out? I was blown away by that. I was like, wow, is this what happens? So you think when you think of other victims, especially of color, because we stayed in the projects at the time, of what they endure, of the fears they have if they have to deal with peace officers with these attitudes or these mentalities, or, like they're condescending, or they're being sarcastic with you, or, this is your culture, or this is what you're used to. And, those type of behaviors have to cease. One of the ideas I had, and it may seem far-fetched, but I don't mind being far-fetched because I'm still here today with my ideas. One of the ideas I had, I thought of a tele-advocate. And to me, a tele-advocate is that no police officer, when he goes out to a sexual assault call or something to do with sexual violence, that he has to, at that instant with that victim, have a advocate or someone on call, if it's not a RAIN representative or a local agency, on call with them as they're dealing with that victim, to make sure they're asking the right questions and getting the proper data and everything that's needed to move forward before they take them to get a forensic exam. Because when you listen to the horror stories, and I hear them all the time, I have people call me directly. A matter of fact, just 3 weeks ago, the young lady, she called me that morning about the assault and her and the boyfriend. And then she called me a few hours later because I have my number of public online, and the police had her in handcuffs, taking her to jail because she tried to go back and get her stuff out of his place. And so I asked her, I said, I took a wild chance. I said, could you put that a female officer, there a female officer there, because there were five police for this Black woman. And she said, there is. And so she put the woman cop online, and I told her who I was. And I said, I know this may sound far-fetched, but this is who I am. This is what I do. And I said, I can do a direct line into my governor, Greg Abbott, whatever I need to do, but I need her to be safe, not in handcuffs, and let's figure everything out later. Get her an exam, get her to the hospital, whatever you need to do, but she should not be in handcuffs because she tried to go back and get her belongings because he had left the property. But these are the horror stories you hear all the time with Black victims, and it frustrates you. So I'm like, what do we need to do? Maybe we need to be radical and you cannot take a call if you haven't had proper training, and if you can't connect with an advocate at that moment, because you cause further damage with victims when you do that. We will shut down. We will not report.
There are police forces that, because in representing the Chicagoland area, everyone knows about the gun violence, and sometimes, police officers, like domestic violence cases, they don't really have the training. So they're sent into some of the most dangerous, situations. But some places now, they do have like a social worker or some type of advocate. Some cities, in America, not everybody, but I think that's, a really good idea. And not only for the police officer, but also the 911 operator.
Yes.
So when they get the phone call, they make sure that they give every detail that needs to be given, so that who's ever going is the best equipped they can be to deal with the situation.
And I know here in Texas, Houston is trying that, but my only reservation is taking live advocates out with them or social workers. And like you just said, it can put them in potential harm's way, where the police officer, he's equipped and ready if something does go awry. But that's my only concern with the live person being there.
Right. Well, telehealth is the thing. I work on that too, so we can do that. Thank you so much, all of you.
Melanie, did you want to add anything to Robin's comment before we move on?
I was just going to say, with your first question in terms of children coming forward, specifically children, what I find, at least here, is that many child sexual assault victims, they are assaulted by somebody that they know, so it does make it a lot harder for them to come forward. It's usually somebody either in the family or within like 2 degrees of separation to the family. Specifically with Black children, there is a history, and it's very unfortunate, but there's a history with Black parents not believing the child and usually taking the side of the intimate partner that they're with, because usually if the child is touched or molested or raped by the stepdad or the mom's boyfriend, mom doesn't want to believe it, dad doesn't want to believe it, so that there's a huge history with that. I also want to echo what Lavinia was just talking about when it comes to the line of questioning that police have, especially when they're dealing with child rape victims, and they say, are you sure that it's not your boyfriend? Are you sure? And I've been questioned the same way when I got arrested when I was trafficked. And it's baffling. I think as a country, sometimes we forget that children can't consent to sex. So how can they consent to rape? And how can they consent to prostitution? And how can they consent to being trafficked? It's really baffling to me. So I think that we do need to definitely have some type of change in the system. I do think that it's imperative. I'm very much in full support of having a victim advocate or a rape crisis specialist or somebody that responds to those calls, not just the officer themselves. I think, especially in a human trafficking case, I think it's also important to know that there are some cops that are sex buyers, and I think that we need to remember that when responding to calls like that. But in terms of just sexual violence and sexual assault in general, I think that there does need to be more training. You hit a nail on the head when you said the 911 operator as well. I think they are the first line of contact before the first responders get there, and usually they lack training in that. So I think that we need to find a way, if we're not going to bring a live social worker or victim specialist online, then at least have them do the trainings for the academy and the police department.
Actually, that'd be interesting, Robin. We could look into that about, we have a colleague, Norma Torres, who was a 911 operator. And it would be interesting to think about training for 911 operators in trauma-informed questioning of the, in the first instance, that would be the way you reached out.
Yeah, my stepdaughter is a 911 operator in Chicago. So I listen to the stories she tells me, and I'm actually working on legislation for 911 operators and first responders, so they make sure their mental health is up to snuff.
Yes. Yeah.
And before they go out and with someone else. So, but I like that idea too, what you're mentioning. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Robin, for being with us. And as Robin mentioned, she's a part of the Congressional Black Caucus and is the chair of their Women and Girls Task Force. So I'm sure she'll be reaching out to you. So thank you, Mr. Katko. Thank you for joining us. My co-chair, we're going to let Mr. Bacon ask his questions, but do you want to say a few words first?
Sure. I mean, if Mr. Bacon's there, let him go first, and then I can jump in afterwards.
Okay, and please meet our new representative-elect, our new colleague, Frank Mervand, who is taking Mr. Vislavsky's seat. So, all right, Don Bacon, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Ann, and great meeting Frank. I look forward to meeting you in person, and so welcome aboard. And I want to thank our guest panelists that come on today and sharing your heartbreaking stories. I just wanted to, first I just want to make a comment about VAWA. The issue is, if it would have been the current VAWA, I think it would have already passed the Senate. It was some of the changes that were proposed. So there's debate over the changes, which I think is unfortunate. I think the longstanding VAWA is still funded right now until there is agreement on the changes. So that's my knowledge of it anyway. I just wanted to thank Lavinia for sharing. I think it's terrible that the Tuskets are put to the side like that. We could have maybe caught a guy that was a serial offender, just like the situation with Gail. And so I appreciate both of you, how you've taken tragedy, heartbreak, and you've turned it into action. And now you're making a positive impact for other people. So I want to thank you. And I know God will bless your good work.
Thank you.
Because you're helping out other people, that you're paving the way for others behind you to get better response and a better action. And I want to also thank Melanie for her statements. So your comments on capitalism I may disagree with, but I do think today, so many people I talk to treat sex trafficking as a victimless crime, and we know it's not. People are being entrapped for various, maybe, it could be threats of violence, manipulation, or drugs, or whatever it may be. And I think we have to keep educating people it's not a victimless crime. People are suffering under it. And so I've been very involved with this in Omaha. And I appreciated Congresswoman Kelly's comments. I came from her area that she represents now. I was raised there. But even in affluent areas, the most affluent areas in Omaha has the highest sex trafficking right now, incidents of it, and people are being entrapped into slaves. So I just think we got to work together to get the word out, because the majority of people just think it's a victimless crime, and it's not. I just wanted to maybe just briefly share a story. I didn't really have a lot of experience with sexual assault. I was a 30-year Air Force guy, but I found myself taking over a unit that had a little bit of a Fort Hood problem. I was a Ramstein Air Base wing commander, and I took it over, and I had a very high incidence of sexual assault, the worst in the Air Force when I came in, and it was unacceptable. And so I worked hard to defeat it. And I used a lot of education. I wanted a lot of people to know this was going on, a lot of transparency. A lot of it was acquaintance rape. It wasn't some stranger rape. It was acquaintance rape, normally alcohol involved. And in the end, I probably court-martialed more people than anybody else for a while, and I cleaned it up. I wanted people to know if you committed this, you're going to be court-martialed. You're going to be put in front of a jury and having to answer. And we ended up having one of the lowest rape allegations in the entire Air Force after 2 years. And so that's why I'm working so much with Congresswoman Spire on the Safe to Report. We have to let women feel safe to come in and report this. And in the military, there was impediments to that. Say if they were underage drinking and they got raped, and they come forward, they can be charged with underage drinking, and that's not right. So we're working to help that, at least in the military. And I just don't really I didn't have a question, just wanted to just comments, but we're here to support and make this better, because this is unacceptable, and I look forward to supporting the co-chairs here and efforts to do our part to beat this crime. And it's a crime, and so thank you for speaking up, and I yield back.
Great, thank you very much, Representative Bacon, for being with us. And I know the work that you're doing with Representative Spear is really important in terms of those, what do they call, collateral crimes, I guess, in the military, that, you know, women can't come forward after an assault because they're going to get charged with underage drinking, which is, you know, Melanie, your story is really just haunting me, that the idea that you were arrested for sex crimes when you were being trafficked at such a young age. And I've met with women who have been trafficked here. I think there are these different corridors around the country where there's a confluence of interstate highways. And but we have an issue here to a certain extent with tourism. And I remember talking to my colleagues in the Midwest during hunting season. You know, there are just these different times during big sporting events. I think it's a big issue. So, well, I know Representative-elect Frank Mervan, that you've been very patient. I think you had your hand up a couple of times. So now you have the floor and whatever questions you might have had.
First and foremost, I want to thank everyone. My name is Frank Mervan, Congressman-elect from Northwest Indiana. I represent Gary, Indiana, up north by the lake, very close to the Chicagoland area. First to Gail and Melanie and Lavina. What I have learned, and I'm going to explain to you what we've done, but what I've learned, the greatest weapon against a predator is a motivated survivor. And I mean that wholeheartedly. And I'll tell my story. I'm a North Township trustee, and I've done that for 15 years. And what we do is we provide poor relief assistance to individuals for 180,000 people. So we see about 3,500 a year. And the majority of them, women of color. We did an ACE study, which is an adverse childhood effects study. And it showed high statistical averages of those who were incapable of keeping a job and working every day, had some sort of childhood trauma and or child sexual abuse. So then in 2017, Indiana ranked is the highest top 5 child molestation reported cases. And as Melanie advised, 90% of them go unreported, correct? According to the CDC, a great deal of them going unreported. So my wife, who is a survivor of child sexual assault, very type A personality, very motivated. Her sister was also a victim of child sexual molestation, and turned to opiates and is no longer with us and left 3 kids behind. So one of my wife's desires and wishes was to educate young people on how predators push boundaries on body safety. So we took that to the schools, and we were able to put a sensitive or a curriculum together that was from K through 12 that was available, and the schools had credit. And we partnered up with the survivors group. We partnered up with our rape crisis centers. We partnered up with the district attorney's office, who had a sex trafficking unit. And we partnered up with the local media, and survivors told their stories over a 6-week period of time. And it was called No More Secrets. And when we talked to 12,000 young people, 73 came forward and were substantiated by Child Protective Services. So we took that data. First, they were able to get the help that they needed. Secondly, what we did is we took that data and we went to the state legislature and we created a no more secrets law. My father is a state senator, so I utilized every resource. And so now in the state of Indiana, with a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and Indiana is a predominantly Republican state. But there was pushback about the education in school about body safety and child safety. But we were able to advocate for a cause and bring light to a very difficult conversation and make a difference. And there's a curriculum now in the state of Indiana through every school district for an hour every year about body safety, how predators push boundaries, advocacy groups go in, and about sex trafficking. And it was something that was impactful to help change people's lives. So that education, and to continue to bring it up and talk about it, is the most valuable tool that we have against a predator. And I believe that. And so I am an advocate for you. And when it comes to women of color and the rape crisis, or rape kits being tested in our county and Lake County, there's a backlog of over 1,000 rape kits. We advocated with the Rape Crisis Center to be able to get all of those tested. And we also were able to advocate through the prosecutor's office and through the police departments to make sure that there was an advocate and a rape crisis advocate on every case. So these are all things that I have worked on. And I want to thank you, because I know firsthand that there's triggers, and it takes courage and bravery, and it never goes away. And my family deals with it every day, and we utilized every resource necessary to be able to make a change. And so education, communication, and strong legislation against predators and against human trafficking, and taking into account women of color and the high statistical averages that we have, how we can help change that in communities and have those dialogues, but more importantly, have legislation that impacts that. So I commend you, and know that I will be an advocate for you, and look forward to being part of this caucus.
Wow, thank you, Frank. So happy to have you in Congress, and with that background and with that personal experience and then that legislative experience. It sounds like an excellent model, and I'll get my team to sit down with your staff and see if we can take that out to a national model. And you're right, these are difficult conversations to have, but incredibly important. And what we've learned over the years with this task force, it's not just women either. It's little boys, men and women, and that in the military, because the numbers are so great, the number of men in the military compared to the number of women, the total number of survivors of men and women is almost the same. So thank you very much. All right, Mr. Katko, you get the last word here. I've got a couple of questions when you're done, but why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I just want to, first of all, commend the panelists for the courage and the strength to come forward and talk, and how you've done something good with a terrible experience. And I really want to commend you on that. And I was, before coming to Congress, I was a federal prosecutor for 20 years. So I have intimate familiarity with all kinds of crimes on the federal level, human trafficking, sex trafficking, and what have you. And also just in my neighborhood, things I understand and experiences that we've seen. And I just want to impart a few things to you, first of all, other than to commend you for what you're doing by speaking up and being advocates. And I think Robin Kelly, my colleague from Chicago, hit on something that's really important. We are in a different age now. We have technology, and when this COVID crisis hit, telehealth came of age. I advocated to get mental health counseling for seniors and let Medicare to pay for it. And now it looks like it's going to be here to stay. And they've reached so many more seniors doing that. And also mental health and telehealth in general, the no-show for mental health counseling dramatically dropped when you did it by telephone or video, as opposed to having to come in person. So you're reaching more people. But the thing I really want to talk about is something that Robin talked about, and that is this advocates. I think Mel, you may touch on it too, maybe Lavinia. This idea of on-the-spot intervention with police. We can't assume that police officers know and understand all these all these things. They have a tremendous amount of responsibilities. They have a tremendous amount of pressure and stress. And not enough emphasis is being put on somebody thinking outside the box. And I'll give you an example in my hometown, Camilla's Police Department. They have an advocate, it's part of a pilot program, an advocate for domestic violence. And that advocate works with one officer who's trained. So anytime there's a domestic violence call, this officer goes to the call. And on that call, if the domestic violence advocate isn't with him, he or she is available by telephone right away or by call right away. So when he gets to the scene and assesses it, knowing that he's not the expert, he has to, of course, make sure things are safe, but then deciding what to do and how to do it, he gets help from an expert. And I think we need to do more of that in this country. And I think you all are onto something. And I don't think it'd be that much more expensive to do it. And you would get it right. I mean, especially with sexual assault survivors. I have 5 sisters, and I'm always extremely protective of them, even at 58 years old. But I think that there's certain things officers don't understand, and sometimes parents don't understand culturally or whatever. And so having that expert available at the fingertips is something we really ought to pursue. And to me, maybe doing like a nationwide pilot program with this, getting some funding dollars, see how it goes and see if we can implement it, makes a lot of sense to me, because I think there's so many sexual assault cases that, to me, go undetected or dismissed out of hand, like you just described, Lavinia, I think, and maybe Melanie. It took you nothing. I think, Lavinia, you were talking about, it took you nothing to get on the telephone, right? And you talked with the person, you were able to make sense. That's something that once the situation is, see, the cop's job is 2 things. Diffuse a situation, however way he has to do it based on his training and experience, right? If there's a shooting going on, obviously you got to secure the scene first. Once that's done and the questioning and investigation begins, they're not always the experts, you know? When I did gang cases and murder cases and capital cases, the people that were most vital to the scene were the people who knew how to process the scene and talk to the witnesses. And if you can't do that, because of all the other experiences you have as a cop, all the duties you have, I think that'll really start thinking about this, because the same thought process to me goes with what I'm trying to do with the Congressional Black Caucus, the Problem Solvers Caucus. I'm a Republican and I'm part of the Problem Solvers Caucus, 25 Democrats, 25 Republicans. And myself and Pete Stauber, who's another a Caucasian Republican, but we're in law enforcement, have teamed up with some Democrats on the caucus, but also leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus, including Karen Bass. And we've drafted a very detailed bill about police brutality and police racial sensitivities and all those things. And one of the things we realize is that they need training, and they need to have mandatory training, in my opinion, in that area. And I perhaps think they should as well. That costs money, and that's what we need to deliver. But we should be able to deliver that. But even if they don't get the training, if they know if there's a domestic violence situation or there's a rape victim, get on the phone, put on a speaker, and let's have a discussion real quick. What happened here? And that will help them better assess the situation. We've got to use our technology better than we're in the midst of a 100-year pandemic, and we're all meeting still. There's ways to do it, and we got to think outside the box more. And we got to empower the advocates and the counselors to be on the front lines with us, even if they're not physically on the front lines. So I'm all about, Marcy, we ought to talk offline, and I hope my staff is on to listen and think about what we can do in this realm. I think what we're trying to do with the police reform bill is the same thing here. And that is basically get some of the experts intertwined with law enforcement. And I think you can have a better outcome altogether. Law enforcement have a better understanding, definitely be more sensitive, and I think better results will happen. And maybe Melanie and Lavinia and the others who have experienced these issues will understand. And so in closing, I just want to commend you all. They're brutally difficult cases, especially child exploitation cases were just awful for me. And they're seared in my mind, and we've got to do more. And your advocacy is very helpful in that regard. So let's talk offline, Marcy. Maybe we can get something going.
Well, thank you very much, John Katko, and your experience as a prosecutor and your lived experience is really important, and also just working in a bipartisan way. That's why I'm so grateful that this bipartisan task force works the way we do. But I'd love to be a part of that. And maybe in that police reform, maybe we can explore further this idea of the that Lavinia has brought up about a teleconsult that would make it available, because it's a nice thing to say. We should, you know, make sure that all of the police in the country have better understanding and better training, but that's probably a pretty heavy lift. If we could have some kind of national resource that's a 1-800 number that they can call into for trauma-informed assessment, you could actually really make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, every officer's got to have a phone on them, and they've got to have a
Yeah.
computer, right? We can get it done. We
Yeah.
just got to think outside the box, man.
No, I'd love to work with you on that. I really would love to work with you. Well, we have gone over an hour, but it's been an incredible conversation. I was going to just briefly, before we close here, one of the challenges is that with COVID, all of the issues that we've talked about have been exacerbated at every aspect of this. And one thing that I did want to share with you is that there is funding, actually $100 million in the HEROES Act, which I'm hoping we will get to yes by next week and get a COVID relief package that we can get over the line for passage in the House and the Senate and to the President for signing. But we will continue to, you know, not only work on these issues, but also the impact of COVID on survivors. And I'm just wondering, just for one more round with our panel here, is there anything about the current situation that you would like to address about COVID and sex trafficking, sexual assault, sexual violence generally? Anything that you've witnessed from your advocacy that we should be aware of? Go ahead, Melanie.
I can definitely speak to the sex trafficking portion, and offline I can also, I wrote an op-ed on this, so I can send you that as well. But there's been an increase, at least here in New York, of trafficking cases and a lot of relapse for those survivors who did exit the sex trade because of COVID, and not just because of COVID, but also because of the lack of resources that outside of unemployment were available to them. So for many people, and I can speak from experience, right? My welfare case got cut off during COVID. I know that there's a lot of people who are receiving food stamps that are no longer receiving food stamps. A lot of people obviously lost their jobs, as we know, or were laid off. Let me not say many, but there's a good number of survivors here in New York who were working restaurant jobs or waitress jobs or things like that. And obviously because of COVID, so many of those had shut down, especially in the earlier months, March, April, May. So because of that, and after the first stimulus, there weren't a lot here, a lot of COVID relief funds, and traffickers and sex buyers were aware of that. So what we saw was a lot of quote unquote sugar baby and sugar dating relationships. We saw that pop up a lot more. Oh, I know that school is hard and you're not working, you know, come, let me help you. We saw a lot of people who have been on their road to recovery, that a lot of our survivors that had substance abuse issues, a lot of them went back to drugs, and a lot of them did relapse back into prostitution. So we saw a huge increase here. It's unfortunate. I know that we don't have, you know, we can't have 5 million stimulus checks to continue helping people out every time, but it has made an impact. And so many people have resorted back to things that they've fought so hard to get away from because of this pandemic. So it's definitely difficult. And I definitely think that it's something that we do need to shed light on during this time.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. That's a silver lining if we get another stimulus package, is thinking how close people are to the margin. And I know here we've seen, and across the country, a 40% increase in opioid addiction and opioid deaths. And it's really tragic. Lavinia or Gail, do you want to add to that?
Hey, Ann, I just want to add real quick that in my district, 100% increase in opioid overdose deaths in year over year. 100% increase.
Tragic.
It's unbelievable. So.
And you've
Yeah.
served with me on our opioid task force and the
Yeah.
progress that we were finally beginning to make. And it's really slid back, really slid back. Yeah, thank you for that. Lavinia, do you want to jump in here?
Basically the same thing here in Texas, the increase of domestic violence cases. I know it's the stresses of not making excuses, but the stresses of not working. You drive down the neighborhoods, you see people's stuff sitting on the streets because they've been evicted. My husband used the phrase, he drives trucks. He said it was like people literally living in trees because they were hiding back in the trees, trying to reside. So the crime is picking up. It's like, it's causing a madness. And I just pray for our country, our community, and I pray that also our first responders and our Congress and everybody do practice self-care as well while going through this, because it's also stressful for us in these positions of leadership and trying to help others, taking on the worries and the burdens while we deal with our own worries and burdens. So that's one thing that we get caught, we forget about sometimes, is self-care of ourselves and making sure we're okay before we try to address the issues of the world and society, because it can be overwhelming. But it's the same here in Texas, but I'll keep praying for our country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And you know, we have, each of us in our own families had issues. We've had colleagues with COVID. I have a niece with the long hauler COVID now. And it's just, I think the ripple impact of this throughout our society. So thank you for that. Gail Gardner, we are going to give you the last word.
I'm so proud of these two young women, and I'm really proud of them. My generation, I'm from the baby boomers, as some of us know, and in the African American community, very strongly is what goes on in this house stays in this house.
Yeah.
We have perpetrated crime in our homes for years. I don't call it a generational curse. I call it for what it is. It's a crime.
Yeah.
And when we don't speak out, and if people are not going to listen, I remember I was 42 years old before I told my mother about the childhood sexual abuse, and it was after the rape, but my counselor that I had for a short period of time suggested it. I want my people to come across that line, and especially with these younger generation. I'm so proud of them because they'll tell it, they will tell. And to keep that and keep it open, so like was said, that we believe them and not to turn them away, and to give them somewhere to talk. If they never go to a counselor, and even the providers in our area who are now giving free counseling, then utilize them. If we're not going to trust, and because we're not very trusting people, but you know, we have our reasons. And so what happens is if we can just get them to someone to listen and begin to, because discourse is the beginning of healing. And if you can push them over that line and get them to talk more about it and to be there for them, that you don't need a degree to do that. You don't need a license to do that. You just need a listening ear. Then from there, we go to the next. I became a pastoral counselor, not because I just wanted to be a counselor so much, because I was a listener, and being a educator, I still keep in touch with the classes of my high school students. And that's because they'll call me and just to listen sometimes, you know, it's things they want to talk about. And one of the things that comes out of this is that being able to put places in near. The provider that we have in Central Florida is quite a ways from another side of Central Florida. Most of the community that needs them, they're not in that community, not because that's where they started, not because they don't want to be, but when they tried to get closer in the community of African Americans, the monies was not there, or the grant was given to someone else. And yes, if there's monies that we can utilize and they can utilize to find themselves expanding in Central Florida into communities that are close by, and to be able to train our police and our law enforcement. and what it's like to have some empathy. And if they can't handle the job, to give it to someone else. I don't see, and I agree, 25-year-olds should not be carrying a gun when they're right out of high school. They have not gone through enough, I believe, in some type, not just training, I'm talking about just being able, where are they mentally? And what has happened in their life, in their past, before they take on to someone else. And that's just my thinking. But I'm believing that someone who's trained, someone who knows, and advocates, I believe we have street creds, you know, and that we can handle some of this and train to be that. So I'm looking to leave a legacy as a baby boomer here before I leave this earth. And that is to push forward on the next generation, not only politically, because I'm just so proud of them politically, I'm just awesome, you know, speaking out, that's all, but also being there and giving them the opportunity to say, this is me, what happened to me too, you know, and I want to be able to say that to them at 73, me too, and it wasn't something that just happened. So I thank you for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to working with you guys again. I'm just loving these two ladies. I'm just so happy to meet them, and I'm excited about what is going on with you, Representative Kuster. And Kuster and all of you who are paying it forward at the legislative top. And when my Congresswoman Val Demings comes home again and I get in touch with her office, I'm going to let her know that I believe she's among some of the best. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. And I have been texting with Val. She was planning to join us and she ended up on a very long call. So I'm sorry that she didn't make it, but I'll share with her So I want to join you in thanking Lavinia and Melanie, just extraordinary advocacy. And I will say for myself, I'm sorry about the buzz in the back, that in my own situation, it took 40 years before I told anyone. And my mother was dead and gone. I never had the chance to even have that conversation with her. But I will say, it was sort of an unusual situation. This was back when we first found out about the young woman that was attacked at Stanford University, and a group of us went to the floor of the House to read her victim statement. And I remember Maxine Waters, Gwen Moore, a number of members of the Congressional Black Caucus were with us. And it was bipartisan, men and women, Republican, Democrat, black, white, everyone was there. And then we started talking afterward, and some of the women, and it was right around that Me Too, and we were all saying, the Me Too, this happened to me, this happened to me. And I had not talked about it. And the first time I told the story was on the floor of the Congress, publicly testifying to it. But I remember I wrote it all out and I showed it to my son and his girlfriend, and her response was very positive to me. And that's so important, that the first person you tell believes you and understands, yes, that I believe you, that happened to you. And I think that's where we need to start, is to believe victims, survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, childhood assault, sex trafficking. And so that's really what this is all about. And all three of you have been tremendous advocates. I'm grateful. Thank you, Robin Kelly, for sticking with us. Thank you, Frank. Wonderful to meet you. I can't wait to work with you as a colleague. And as always, thank you to John Katko and Dave Joyce, Don Bacon, all of our colleagues who joined us today. So thank you, and be well, stay safe, wear your mask when you go out. We will get through this, we promise. Take good care.
Be well, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.